When you hear the word kidnapping, it is without question a term that causes a visceral reaction in you, in everyone, whether you're a prosecutor, whether you're a defense attorney, whether you're a judge, whether you're a member of the public. It is a serious, and in many instances, a violent strike felony in California. And you think about situations where people are whisked away from their family. They're taken against their will, usually by force or fear, and they're put in a car and they're transported like you see on TV. Doesn't always have to be that way though, especially in California. In this video, we're going to dive into the different types of kidnappings that we see, different types of kidnappings you could be charged with, and particularly explore aggravated terms of kidnapping. If convicted of aggravated kidnapping, let's say for instance, kidnapping for purpose of sexual assault, you could be facing 25 to life in prison for an aggravated kidnapping. There are so many nuances to kidnapping charges in California. There are so many defenses to kidnapping charges in California. In this video, we're going to explore a lot of them to help you understand how you could protect your freedom, how you could protect your future if you were a loved one charged with kidnapping in California. Kidnapping in California generally falls under Penal Code Sections 207 through 209. And across the board, there's really three main elements, three things that the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt, each and every element, in order to get a conviction whenever you're charging someone with basic kidnapping laws in California. The first is that you took someone somewhere against their will. They needed to be moved is the second element, no matter how slight. It could be an inch, it could be miles, it could be across the world. And third, and this is really important, at the time of the movement, they moved based on your force or the fear that you put in that individual. If those three elements are met, generally speaking, you're going to be dealing with a difficult defense to a kidnapping charge. But not all hope is lost. Remember, each and every element must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And in this video, we're going to go into more in depth about defenses to kidnapping, and we're going to talk about some unique real life instances on cases that we've had where at first glance it's like, wow, that's a really bad kidnapping. But when you unpack the evidence, when you unpack the law and you actually read the jury instructions that are required in a case like kidnapping, you'll understand there are much more defenses, many more things you could do than may appear at first glance to help you protect your freedom and regain some control over a situation that at first glance may seem like all hope is lost. Generally speaking, there's really two types of degrees or two types of situations we're dealing with when we're talking about kidnapping in California. The first is your general kidnapping, right? So your more traditional kidnapping without any unique circumstances surrounding it, where if you are charged, if you are convicted, you're looking at the potential of a strike felony and up to 8 years in state prison. If you are charged with aggravated kidnapping, right? Kidnapping plus certain factors, if the alleged victim was under 14, if the purpose of the kidnapping was to facilitate, let's say, a sex crime or things along those natures, then you're subject to potentially the one strike sex law in California, or basically, the 3 strikes and you're out. Sex crimes, kidnapping combined, lethal combination in California because you're looking at 25 to life if you're convicted. So they'll need to prove, they being the district attorney, will need to prove it was your more traditional kidnapping and that at least one of those other factors were present. If they do that, that's where you turn to traditional kidnapping, where you normally would get only up to 8 years, into a case where you could be spending the rest of your natural life in prison. As such, it is essential to make sure you understand the kidnapping laws, and at the very least, the attorney standing by your side with you and for you with so much at stake better know well how to deal with, how to understand, and how to defend against kidnapping charges, whether we're talking about the most basic kidnapping around or the most aggravating circumstances around that could land you in prison for the rest of your life. Now, so far in this video, we kept alluding to aggravated kidnapping. Well, let's go in the other direction. Let's talk about what else you could be convicted of, even if you beat a kidnapping case. Because remember, a lot of times it's not all or nothing, meaning it's not a situation where you may walk in and say, well, I have a good defense of kidnapping, so I know I'm going to go home, right? Because there's lesser offenses or lesser related offenses, one of which under Penal Code Section 236 or 237, which is known as false imprisonment. That's basically restraining the movement of another, right? So what we don't see necessarily are the requirements that that person actually be moved a distance, no matter how slight, and we're not seeing over and over again that force and fear movement. Within the same realm, though, is false imprisonment cases. We see and have seen a lot more, especially in the federal level and also in the state level, human trafficking charges being filed. Traditionally, we'd only see, pimping or panhandling pandering or those types of charges over the years. In the last couple of years in particular, at both federal and state level, we have seen human trafficking. And at first glance, right, if when you first hear the term human trafficking, you're thinking maybe we're dealing with children from third world countries and bringing them here. Those types of situations, not always the case. Human trafficking is more common than what you think, and prosecutors are charging people who you normally wouldn't think could be or would be charged with human trafficking just based on the relationship that they have. So that's something certainly to be aware of. Then we're talking about aggravating factors that turn your traditional kidnapping into an aggravated kidnapping that subjects you to California's 3 strikes law, or more importantly, the 1 strike law, where you could spend the rest of your life in prison even if you have a flawless record. We're talking about the age of the alleged victim, a minor under 14. We're talking about to facilitate a sex crime, to commit a kidnapping, to facilitate a sex crime, to torture someone during the course of the kidnapping, or to get someone from point A to point B. There are so many factors, it seems like each year more and more are coming, where you turn a normal traditional kidnapping into a case that becomes a lifetime felony in California. In the next segment, we're going to start talking about some defenses and some unique situations that we have seen in our experience here at the firm that should help you along your journey in successfully defending a kidnapping charge in California. Here's some legal defenses you may have for kidnapping. Well, first is it wasn't you, right? They still need to prove that you were actually the person involved in this alleged crime. But a lot of times it's not that straightforward. A lot of times you're there. You're being accused by someone who was in your presence. It's not a matter of, well, it wasn't me. The identity was wrong. Sometimes that's the case. A lot of times it's not. So you could look at intent. You could look at consent of the party. Many times what we'll see is someone goes with someone voluntarily, at least initially, and then they say later on, hey, let me out of the car. I don't want to be here no more. I don't want to get back in the car with you. Well, that's problematic from a prosecutor's standpoint, because jurors will look at that and say, well, but she went with him, or he went with her. You're telling me that's a kidnapping. Well, legally it can be, because you could withdraw consent as the alleged victim of a crime at any time. We see that a lot in sexual assault cases. You could still have a kidnapping charge when you initially consented to go with someone. Consent is important. When was it given? When was it taken away? Another thing that we see a lot of times is looking at the actual component of movement. When someone was moved, were they moved, and at what point in time were they moved compared with the element of force or fear? Remember, we talked about 2 key elements of basic kidnapping being force or fear to make someone move, no matter how slight. But imagine a situation where someone's maybe moving and then they stop, but there's no force or fear. That could very well be a defense to kidnapping as well. Sometimes, especially in the federal courts, what we'll see are parental rights arguments. Maybe there's a situation where there's an order, a divorce order, that parent A is not allowed to take the kids without parent B's consent out of state, let alone out of the country. And the parent does that in defiance of the court order. Could that be a federal charge? Absolutely. Are there defenses to it? Absolutely. Not all hope is lost. And finally, arguably the worst type of situation, if you find yourself accused of kidnapping someone, is a false accusation. Your accuser is vindictive. Your accuser may be scorned. Your accuser is lying. Your accuser is trying to get back at you for something that you might have done to them, which might have been very legal. These are dangerous, but you know what? The penalties are exactly the same. The consequences are exactly the same. The stakes are just as high. There are many defenses to kidnapping. Sometimes your best defense may be,
hey, it's not a kidnapping, it's a false imprisonment.
Voluntarily be convicted of false imprisonment. Convict me of false imprisonment, not of kidnapping. So many differences in penalties. So many differences in where you do your time, if you do your time, what collateral consequences, sex offender registration, potential immigration consequences. All of those factors play into defenses that you and your attorney should be exploring early and often to craft a defense that matches your needs and the facts of the case, not just one or the other. Now, so far in this video, we've talked a lot about legal concepts. We've talked a lot about hypothetical defenses. A real life example. A few years ago, our firm represented an individual who was driving for a rideshare company. That individual was accused of picking up an intoxicated female who believed she was getting into the rideshare that she called. Well, she didn't. She got into our client's rideshare vehicle. So they're going along in the general direction of where she's supposed to be going, where she thought she was going, until that stopped and she was going in the wrong direction and the vehicle pulled over. At that point, it was alleged that our client got out of the vehicle and helped himself into the back seat, where he informed the accuser, in this case the victim, that she was in the wrong Uber and she was going to have to pay him a different way, implying that he wanted to have sex with her. This individual, our client, was charged with aggravated kidnapping. A gentleman with no record was facing 25 years to life alone on one count. He was also charged with other offenses like attempted rape and some other offenses related to the conduct as well. But the biggest obstacle we had, the biggest obstacle in resolving the case favorably, was that 25 to life aggravated kidnapping, because the prosecutor alleged that this was kidnapping for the purpose of rape. And it very well might have been at first glance, but when we looked at the actual elements of the offense and we examined when the victim in fact had that first sign of fear, how that related to her movement, we were able to prove through her own testimony that at the time she first felt fear, the vehicle had already stopped. She was no longer being moved. Now, make no mistake about it, this does not condone anything our client did that night. It was wrong. It was terrible. It was a crime, and he went to prison for it, and in all likelihood will have to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. But the important part here is, even though you're charged with aggravated kidnapping, even though the public may be appalled by the conduct, even though you yourself may be appalled by what you're accused of doing, there are still defenses. The law is still the law. Elements still need to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt by the prosecution. And when they can't, it doesn't mean, oh, you get another guy off and he gets to go home. There was still accountability in this case. There was still a state prison sentence in this case. But it gave this individual an opportunity to one day get out, to one day get back with his wife and family, to one day get back in the community because of the defense to the aggravated kidnapping charge. Cannot stress how important that is, to actually read the law, to understand what your rights are, to understand what needs to be proven, and plan your defense accordingly. So remember what we said. Kidnapping charges are not to be taken lightly. Even a basic kidnapping charge could land you in state prison for many years. Not to mention you will have a strike on your record that will stay with you in many instances for the rest of your life. And if you throw in an aggravating circumstance, depending on the age or the situation as alleged by your accuser, forget it. You're dealing with a lifetime case. Even more serious, even more at stake. Sex offender registration, the ability to potentially never walk out of prison once you walk in. Well, what do we know? We know that there are a lot of defenses to kidnapping, arguably more for kidnapping than are for a lot of other types of offenses. And not only did we just talk about the general defenses as defined by law, we were able to go through a real life situation of a client of our firm and how we were able to utilize one of the many defenses to kidnapping to help that individual not necessarily escape culpability altogether and get to walk out the door with no consequence, but to turn what was charged as an aggravated kidnapping where he could have faced the rest of his life in prison to a more reasonable fact, a more reasonable sentence, a more reasonable outcome that was supported by the facts and by the law. So what's important is that you share your comments in this video, you like this video if you like this video, but more importantly than sharing your comments and your likes is to share this with someone that may need help, to share this with someone that may need some information, to share this with someone who may be going through something or may have a family member going through a kidnapping charge and may get overwhelmed by the thought of it, let alone if they're charged with aggravated kidnapping. It'll point them in the right direction to let them understand there are things that potentially can be done to mitigate the damage that's been done and to help fight the case, whether that is fighting the case all the way to trial, whether that's litigating the case before trial. It's a combination of the two, all to make sure you do whatever you can to regain control of your future, to protect your freedom. You have to know your rights.